Last week we thought about Peter preaching the gospel to Cornelius, the Roman centurion, and how the gospel message is for everyone. To some people in the early church, a Roman officer might not seem like a likely person to become a Christian, but the news of Jesus was even for him. For the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at another unlikely convert. His name was Saul, but he later became known as Paul. The reason I call him an unlikely convert is because when we first meet him in the book of Acts, he's a Pharisee, and he's helping with the execution of a Christian. Like many Jewish religious leaders at that point, Saul thought that the message about Jesus was a heresy, and he was determined to stamp it out. To cut a long story short, Saul has an encounter with the risen Jesus, he becomes a Christian, and ends up helping to play a major part in spreading the gospel message around the Mediterranean regions. However, this wasn't without its problems, and Saul, who persecuted Christians, becomes Paul, a Christian who was persecuted. As we saw in those videos, one of the major places Paul visited was Ephesus. He spent about 2 or 3 years there, and during that time many people believed the message that he brought. However, there were also many people who didn't believe. The good news about Jesus was a controversial message. It was controversial to the Jews because many of them thought that Jesus' claims to be the Son of God were blasphemous. They knew that God had said that he alone is God and there are no others, which is true. Paul showed them through the Old Testament scriptures that Jesus was actually the Messiah that God had promised them, and this Messiah would be God himself in human form. However, in spite of this, many of them still couldn't see that Jesus is actually God. The message was controversial to the Greeks and the Romans as well. They had many false gods, and they had a problem accepting that there is actually only one God. And the idea of God becoming a human and being killed on a Roman cross seemed ridiculous to them. On top of this, the Roman emperor also demanded that he should be recognised as a god. And so when Christians said that Jesus Christ is Lord and not Caesar, that got them into a lot of trouble. This leads us to the riot in the amphitheatre. On the surface, it looks like a religious clash. Ephesus was the centre of worship for a false goddess called Diana, or Artemis. And the message that Paul brought was a challenge to this. To recognise Jesus Christ as Lord is also to recognise that this idol was a lie. As I read this incident, I was reminded of some other passages from the Old Testament that also comment on this particular issue. Psalms 115 and 135 both contrast worship of the living God, the only real one, with worship of idols, and they have almost identical passages which basically mock idol worship. They read something like this. Their idols are silver and gold, made by the hands of men. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but they cannot smell. They have hands but they cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter any sound from their throats. Those who make them will be just like them, and so will all who trust in them. Isaiah 44 also contains a prophecy where God warns his people against worshipping idols, pointing out how foolish it was. He talks about how a man might go out and cut down a tree, and use part of the wood for firewood, and the other part to make an idol, without stopping to think how foolish it is to think that something he's carved out himself, using the same wood that he used to cook his dinner, could actually do anything to help him. It's exactly the same thing with these Ephesians. Although the worship of this figure was such a major part of Ephesian life, Artemis couldn't do a single thing to help them. It was just some figment of their imagination. On the other hand, they were rejecting the one true God, the one who created them, and the only one who could save them. However, as we read this passage, it becomes clear that there's more to this than just a religious disagreement. The riots were started by a group of metal workers who had built a rather profitable career making replicas of this idol. They had noticed that as people were turning to Jesus, it was affecting their business, They were concerned that if people stopped worshipping this idol, they wouldn't be buying their products, and so they would be out of a job. Not only did these people worship this idol, they also worshipped the money that they could make from the worship of it. But to inspire the crowds to go along with their complaints, these people also appealed to another idea. Because Ephesus was the centre of worship for this idol, and it was a major part of their culture, the people also seem to have thought that any threat to the reputation of this idol was also a threat to their national identity. This is the same today in many countries around the world where following a particular religion is seen as part of the national identity, and to become a Christian is seen as a betrayal of this. The riot was eventually dispersed without any real harm to Paul or his companions. However, in the years that followed, Christians in Ephesus were persecuted for their faith. We saw in the videos how they used signs like the fish to help identify fellow believers. Around the world today, many Christians are also persecuted for following Jesus. From being mistreated by society and rejected by family to false imprisonment, acts of violence, and even death, these people really experience the cost of following Jesus. There are some great organisations like Open Doors who work to support Christians who are being persecuted. If I'm honest, I used to be a bit scared about hearing some of the stories of the things that happened, but actually I found that as I've read the testimonies of these people, I found that the faith that they show can help to strengthen my own. Amongst the painful stories of persecution are some great testimonies of how God is at work, even in these dark situations. I remember reading about a man in India who was put in prison, but while he was there, he led a whole load of the other prisoners to Jesus. There are wonderful testimonies of how God answers prayer when these people put their trust in him because they have nowhere else to turn. And the examples of Christians who stay faithful to God, even in spite of the persecution they experience, can be a challenge as well as an encouragement. To round this up, let's look at the question, what does this actually mean for us? All this talk about idol worship might seem a bit irrelevant, but as I hinted earlier, the people also idolised other things, money for example. And the same is true in our culture today. People don't bow down to statues of mythical beings, but instead they tend to idolise other things, whether that's careers, possessions, interests and hobbies, or relationships. And yet, when God says, "You shall have no other gods beside me," he's talking just as much about these sorts of things as he is about statues and idols. These things may not necessarily be bad things, but when our attitude to them is wrong, they can become things that we worship. God alone deserves our ultimate devotion, and if anything threatens to take his place, then we need to take action to put those things back where they belong, either by sorting out our priorities or by removing things from our lives which shouldn't be there.